Hello and welcome to everyone. This is the Alaska Collaborative on Health and Environment webinar entitled Plastics and Climate Change, Consequences of Plastics Production, Use, and Disposal as a Major Contributor to Climate Warming and Harms to Human Health. I'm your host for today, Nick Reardon, calling in from our offices here in Anchorage and Alaska Community Action on Toxics. My office and home here in Anchorage are on the traditional and unceded lands of the Dena'ina people. So I'd just like to express my own and my coworkers' ongoing appreciation for past and present stewards of this wonderful place. For those of you new to this webinar series, the Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment, it's a regional partner of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment, which we often abbreviate as CHE or pronounce as CHE. And so together, CHE and CHE Alaska and other CHE partners, we're working to advance knowledge as well as action related to these links between human health and environmental factors. So you can learn more at our respective websites. we're here at akaction.org, and the CHE National is healthandenvironment.org. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today, or if you're tuning in to the recording at a later date. I invite you to use the Zoom's Q&A button, which is kind of at the bottom center of your screen, if you want to direct questions to me, the moderator, or directly to our guests. And you can use the chat box as well. That's particularly useful for sharing links or resources or dialogue sort of amongst the whole group. Don't worry if you mix the two of them up, though. We'll figure it out on our end. So I'd also like to extend special thanks to any Alaska legislators, our senators and representatives and their staff who could join us today. You're busy people, and so I very much appreciate you taking the time to tune in and for your concern about these interconnected issues of chemicals and plastics and climate change. So just to provide a little bit of context before we go on, these issues are especially relevant for Alaskans. As many of you have probably heard, the Arctic is warming 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet as a whole. One less talked about, but no less significant effect of this is the release and mobilization of contaminants and microplastics that have otherwise been frozen and trapped in sea ice, permafrost, and glaciers. Persistent industrial chemicals and toxic plastics are transported on atmospheric and oceanic currents from lower latitudes to higher latitudes as part of a natural global distillation process. But as these temperatures rise, these sequestered contaminants and plastics emerge, and they bioaccumulate, and they threaten our oceans, animals, and because of the disproportionate warming in the north, the peoples of the north. And so, because of a reliance on traditional foods from the sea, Arctic indigenous peoples have some of the highest levels of these persistent pollutants of any population on Earth. Delbert Pungawi, a Yupik tribal leader from Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, highlighted the threats to health and human rights by saying, "We are overwhelmed with concern about the health harms associated with climate change, the loss of sea ice and melting permafrost, and the mobilization of chemicals and plastics. These are all interconnected, and we are running out of time," end quote. So with the interconnected nature of these issues in mind, I'd really like to introduce these 2 guests we have, very grateful to have. We're joined by Judith Eng, who is the founder and president of the organization Beyond Plastics, which works on plastic pollution issues. She's also a senior fellow and visiting faculty at Bennington College, where she teaches classes on plastic pollution. And we're also joined by Jim Vallette, the co-founder and president of Material Research, an organization that specializes in analyzing global supply chains and impacts of toxic chemicals, greenhouse gases, and waste. Jim is also the lead researcher and author of the report that brings us together here today, The New Coal, Plastic, and Climate Change, which highlights the relationship between plastics and greenhouse gas emissions, basically along each stage of the plastic cycle, its production, its use and disposal, etc. So if you've already read the report, that's great. And if you haven't, I really strongly recommend you take a look. It is succinct and clear and compelling. And yeah, I'm really grateful to both of you for joining us here today. and as well as for everyone else who's tuning in. So welcome again, Judith and Jim. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Nick. And it's an honor to be with Jim Villette, who is the author of this report and who made it so succinct and clear. The worst thing is really long reports that no one reads. And so we think our report is the opposite. Just last week, the National Environmental Group, Oceana, released a poll that they commissioned from the Ipsos polling company and found that 80% of American voters want to see significant reductions in single-use plastic. And that is encouraging. And I'm guessing that most voters are thinking about the impact of plastic in rivers and oceans. For instance, we know that between 8 and 15 metric tons of plastic enter the ocean every year, 80% of it from the land. And people are generally aware that this is an ocean problem. It's a waste problem. I'm a big supporter of recycling. I started my town's recycling program in a little town where I live in upstate New York, near the Vermont border. I teach at Bennington College, and paper, metal, glass can achieve a higher recycling rate. I know it's harder in Alaska in terms of access to markets, but plastic recycling has been abysmal, achieving a recycling rate of only about 8.5%. And that's why you see the petrochemical industry pushing something called chemical recycling or advanced recycling, which is typically gasification or pyrolysis in different types of heating plastic. Plastics is also very much in environmental justice issues on both ends. When you look at where plastic is produced, it's predominantly in low-income communities of color, most notably Louisiana and Texas and Appalachia. And then when it comes to disposal, because you can't really recycle most plastics, it's disposed of in incinerators and landfills that are almost always cited in environmental justice communities. We know it's a health issue. There are microplastics in our food, in the air that we breathe. There was a study by Italian researchers last year that found for the very first time the presence of microplastics in the human placenta on both the maternal side and the fetal side. And that just kind of stops me in my tracks when you think of this. But what a lot of people don't realize is the climate change connection. And that's why we issued this report last November, which I hope you all have, which has a great photo of our friend Sharon Levine on the cover, because she is a citizen advocate in Louisiana who is working against the Formosa ethane cracker facility. And I think we want to recognize, there's a human element to this story. It's not just about molecules and microplastics. People are hurt when they live near facilities that are manufacturing plastics. So what our report looked at is 10 distinct ways that greenhouse gases are released from plastic production, use, and disposal, from fracking to cracking to incineration. Our report found that plastics is a major source of greenhouse gases that few people in government know about or are doing anything about. What we did was compare the greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants to plastics. And what we found was disturbing. As of 2020, the US plastics industry is responsible for 232 million tons of greenhouse gases every year. So you're probably thinking, well, what's the context? What does that mean? That is the equivalent of emissions from 116 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants. Our math, or I should say Jim's math, supports that in the near future, the US plastics industry contribution to climate change is on track to exceed the greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants in the US. And the health impacts of these emissions are disproportionately borne by low-income Americans and immigrants and people of color, making this an environmental justice issue. The reason we can do this comparison is that 75% of coal plants in the US have been closed in recent years. That's a really important accomplishment, the result of really hard work by the environmental community. But we also found that plastics are replacing coal as a major source of atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. So remember how long it took and how hard it has been to shut down polluting coal-fired power plants. And now to have those greenhouse gas emissions replaced by plastic production is really, really a travesty. And what's happening is if you look at the fossil fuel industry, the two major sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the fossil fuel sector is from transportation and electricity generation. So on the transportation sector, we're seeing more things get electrified. Who among us is not on a waiting list to get an electric car? Investments in mass transit, electrifying truck deliveries. And then on the power side, finally, we're seeing increased commitments to energy efficiency and clean renewable energy sources like solar, wind, geothermal. So the petrochemical industry knows that there's a reduction in the demand for their product. And so they have decided that plastic production is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. We were not asked about that. These are investment decisions that they have been making. At least 42 plastic facilities have opened or expanded since 2019. If they become fully operational, these new plastic plants could release an additional 55 million tons of greenhouse gases. And that's the equivalent of another 27 coal-fired power plant. So plastics are the new coal. Our report identified 18 communities where more than 90% of the climate pollution is released. They're all low-income communities and communities of color. Half, 53% of these communities were in Texas, and a third were in Louisiana. I just want to take a minute, and then I'll wrap up, to explain what ethane crackers are, because you're going to hear this phrase a lot. Right now, there are about 1 million new oil and gas wells that are hydrofracked in the United States. And typically at a hydrofracking site, a waste gas, ethane, is released into the atmosphere. It's vented. That's not a good thing. It's a potent greenhouse gas. What we are now seeing is that waste gas being captured, sent by new pipelines and sent to new industrial facilities called ethylene cracker facilities. And why do they exist? They heat the ethane to high temperature, it cracks, that's the funny name, ethane cracker facility. And then it's the byproduct, or it's the main ingredient rather, of single-use plastic packaging. So the other end of the factory, you get massive amounts of plastic pellets or powder. The Shell facility in Bucks County, Pennsylvania is a joint venture between ExxonMobil and SABIC. I'm sorry, Bucks County, Pennsylvania is just Shell, and that's going to come online at the end of this year. Greenhouse gas emissions are significant, but also a fair amount of air toxics. So it is proving a risk to the community where it's sited, also a significant amount of water pollution. So altogether, that's why we call plastics the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. But what's the plan B for the rest of us? So I am really excited to have you now hear from Jim Villette with Material Research, which is an impressive research operation out of Maine. Beyond Plastics contracted with Jim to do this report, and he'll walk you through the report in some greater detail. Then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Nick and Che Alaska. It's really nice to be with you today, sharing some of the findings of our collaboration with Judith. Judith is the one who made everything succinct, not me. I'll make that clear. And it's been a great privilege to work with her and her team. It's been an amazing collaboration to see, and especially to see how widely the findings of this report have gone worldwide and really have helped, hopefully, to expand the understanding of this industry and its impacts and its the centrality of it in climate policy. So I'll start with, let me pull this up. Slideshow. Okay, whoops, I need to share first. Pardon me. Get this on the right setting. Where am I? Sorry, I have this interference here. Okay. Slideshow. Here we go. All
That's
right.
good.
All right. So yeah, that's my name. And Material Research is a small company I started a few years ago from the NGO world, nonprofit world, but we work with NGOs and journalists around the world looking at the impacts of supply chains. And this is occupying a lot of our time, tracking these supply chains of petrochemicals and plastics. This is the web page that I think you'll see in the chat linked to, that has all the material and features this report along with supplemental resources that I hope you will find useful. It's really intended as an open access collaboration. This information is for everybody. We're not holding anything in-house. And what's one of my goals is to have global understanding through open information and collaborations like this. So on this page, you'll find the methodology for our calculations. I don't think, Judith, you've ever found any pushback on the methodologies we've had from the industry. There's a map of the facilities in the United States that are related to the plastics industry and a spreadsheet with a lot of information about these factories. The cornerstone of our report is this spreadsheet. It details roughly 150 million out of the 232 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions that we associate with the plastics industry in this report. Each year, facilities with significant amounts of greenhouse gas pollution must report this information to the US Environmental Protection Agency. In 2020, well over 120 factories that filed greenhouse gas emission reports were related to the production of plastics. And you have to have a pretty high threshold of releases to be one of those reporting facilities. So our spreadsheet groups these facilities by the communities in which they are located. It includes a lot of details like what the plant makes and what it's planning to do in the future. We drew a lot on the potential emissions from a great database that I would refer you to, Oil and Gas Watch. It just launched in January, but they shared spreadsheets in advance. And you can track the potential emissions from projects all throughout the United States, especially in Alaska. There are so many potential emissions. You'll find the projects that they're tracking on that site, Oil and Gas Watch. That's the spreadsheet. There's also a map in the report that has had over 15,000 views, and you can really drill down and see the facilities that we're talking about. Our calculations for the report include the estimated releases of methane, which Judith mentioned. It's very potent, extremely potent greenhouse gas. It's leaked into the atmosphere when these natural gas liquids are extracted by fracking and when they're processed and distributed to the plastics industry around the world. At least 36 million tons. And just every time you hear, every time I say millions of tons, 2 million tons is the equivalent of what an average 500 megawatt power plant released in 2020. So that's our baseline comparison. If you hear 2 million tons, that's a coal-fired power plant. So about at least 36 million tons of methane greenhouse gas emissions are leaked just from the extraction of these feedstocks for plastics. Those calculations are based on rates calculated recently by Dr. Haworth of Cornell and Dr. Jacobson of Stanford. And you can see that in each section of the report, we have these icons that represent those roughly 2 million tons of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent gases. So the methane leakage caused by plastics production, as you can see, is the equivalent of the climate pollution from 18 average coal-fired power plants. But that already is an understatement. Everything I'm saying here is an understatement. For consistency, we're following the EPA's regulatory framework, how they track carbon dioxide equivalents between gases. And for methane, they're using a 100-year time frame. And that using that time frame, methane has the carbon dioxide equivalents of 25 times. But in the actual lifespan of methane in the atmosphere, it has a much greater impact, at least 84 times the impact of carbon dioxide. So if you use this more realistic conversion rate, our calculation of 36 million tons for releases from fracking balloons to 120 million tons, the equivalent of 60 coal-fired power plants. Gas liquids extracted for plastics and transported by pipelines to massive chemical plants is the next stage. And these crackers, as Judith explained, they superheat the gas until the molecules crack into the new components, including ethylene, that are the essential ingredients of plastics. Our report provides details on where these crackers are located, as you can see in this map, and where new ones are planned. Our webpage, or Beyond Plastics webpage for this project, also includes this map that I mentioned earlier. In the map, the facilities are coded to the amount of greenhouse gases they release. So the darker the color, the more they are released. And it has all the 120 plus facilities on this map. And you can drill down, and when you drill down, you see these clusters, these petrochemical clusters, these essential production regions for the world, for the plastics of the world. They might not be the plastic product, but they're the resins and they're the feedstocks, they're the ethylene and the methylene, the MEG, the ethylene glycol, the ethylene oxide, the styrene that goes into polystyrene. All these are clusters and they're interrelated to each other and to plants that can be on the other side of the planet. But they are congregated largely in Louisiana and Texas. Many people look at petrochemical plants in isolation from each other. Much of our work that I see in the NGO world is fighting one plant first, but it's not in context of its relation to the other plants, even in the same community. So strategically, we need to, when we're setting policies as policymakers, we need to understand the context of this plant in the global supply chain and its impacts, how it's related to production upstream and downstream, and to that community in which it's located. In these communities that bear the brunt, they're at the front lines of climate pollution and all sorts of other pollution, plastic dust and powder that are released constantly into the air and into the estuaries around these plants. This pollution causes extreme cumulative impacts in some of the countries, in some of the world's really most vulnerable communities. One of the report's key findings is that plastics factories in 18 communities, as Judith mentioned, are responsible for over 90% of this industry's reported greenhouse gas emissions. You can find this table in the methodology appendix to the report. So it shows the number of people in the closest proximity to the industry. It's weighted by population. And through this, it reveals that on average, 67% of the people living near plastics plants are people of color and have far less income than the rest of the United States and are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of pollution. In addition to crackers, major sources of carbon, of climate pollution, are chemical plants that make chlorine. And chlorine is a toxic gas in itself. And when it's combined with ethylene, it makes vinyl plastics. Another major source is methanol. Methanol is used to produce formaldehyde resins. These are the kinds of adhesives that are used in engineered wood products like countertops. Methanol factories are becoming pretty major contributors to climate change. The unit pictured here is in Beaumont, Texas. And this small unit released 1 million tons of greenhouse gases in 2020. New methanol plants are becoming among the biggest sources of potential emissions. 10 new methanol plants are planned in communities like St. James Parish, Lake Charles, and Geismar, Louisiana. And according to the Environmental Integrity Project's analysis of new permits, these new plants could emit a combined 10 million tons of greenhouse gases per year if and when they're built. I know in the Pacific Northwest, in at least in Oregon and Washington, there have been plans for methanol plants for export to Asia for production of plastics there. I don't think it's taken off as much because of the cheap plastic and related feedstocks in the Gulf Coast. But certainly that is where I've seen probably the most interaction of the plastics industry, not in Alaska, but over in Washington and Oregon. Another trend I see, a really important trend, is how much of the plastics industry in the United States is export oriented. At the latest data, 44% of the plastics resins made in the United States are made for export for customers overseas. Just in the last 5 years, a whole new category of ships were launched that are gathering ethane feedstocks from the United States. These vessels, which are 600 feet long or longer, they're called very large ethane carriers. They saddle up to the end of pipelines in Texas and Pennsylvania, and they haul ethane to crackers overseas in India, China, and Europe. Ethane obtained by hydraulic fracturing in West Texas becomes single-use packaging in India every day. Through these exports, plastics is very much like the new coal because the coal industry also is counting on exports to stay alive. A lot of my work in recent decades has been on building materials. And one of the trends that I've noticed since 2012 has been a massive increase in plastic flooring. This is kind of leading edge of what happens overseas and how US consumption, how US companies that are bringing in plastics are responsible for global pollution through kind of macroeconomic shifts. This is one of the highest impact imports of plastics that I have found. This is plastics flooring. China has figured out a way to make plastic floors from coal rather than gas liquids like ethane. And it's a lot cheaper to make these floors, to make these plastics in this process in China. And the flooring industry in the United States abandoned scores of factories in the United States in favor of this production in China. Since 2012, over 2,500 workers have lost their jobs in flooring factories in the US as imports of this vinyl flooring soared to nearly 6 billion square feet in 2020. And 80% of these imported plastic floors are made in China. The production of these floors relies on state-controlled production that ensures extremely low labor costs and minimal environmental protection. The production of these fluors is causing the release of toxic pollutants like mercury and dioxins and millions of tons of carbon dioxide. And this pollution is carried, as Nick was describing, by atmospheric currents to Alaska and its vital ecosystems. That includes chlorinated pollutants, persistent pollutants that Nick was talking about. They will be re-released and just accelerate the toxic exposures and accumulation in the Arctic and subarctic. Another really concerning source of emissions from the plastics industry comes from fluorocarbons, such as hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, used as blowing agents in plastic insulation. Just 1 year's production of fluorochemicals used in plastic insulation in the United States will have the climate impact of at least 13 coal-fired power plants. There has been very little public attention on this, even though the United Nations says that eliminating the use of fluorochemicals in plastic insulation worldwide would prevent over 1 billion, not million, tons of greenhouse gases per year. That's 500 coal-fired power plants a year, just from using these chemicals in plastic insulation. Because these hydrofluorocarbon gases escape from plastic insulation from the time it's installed to the time it's buried in landfills and beyond. A year ago, I was walking with a bucket on a shoreline not far from my town here in Maine. I joined people who were picking up pieces of plastic from the intertidal zone of Penobscot Bay, shred by shred, from pebbles and seaweed. The plastic wastes came from a bale that fell from a ship that was delivering this waste from Europe to a municipal waste incinerator near my home. Among this plastic waste, I found dental floss. Most of this floss is coated with PFAS chemicals. When PFAS chemicals are burned, as these were destined to do in the incinerator, extremely potent gases are released. Some of these gases are 10,000 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. When incinerators were built decades ago, waste was very different. Their air permits were based on assumptions that are no longer relevant. The proportion of household trash that is plastic today is double what it was in 1990. It's now about 20% of the municipal waste stream. And fluorochemicals are in many, many products. Regulations have not caught up. This is a critical gap in federal policy that could, if it were closed, have great benefits for the climate. It's one of many major data gaps in our understanding of plastics industry and its impacts on the climate and human health and ecological health. Our estimate, again, that the US plastics industry is responsible for 232 million tons of greenhouse gases per year. That is just a floor, it's not a ceiling, and it's really quite conservative. Our research has continued since Judith and Beyond Plastics published this report in October. Through our work with nonprofits and reporters around the world, our understanding of these global supply chains is improving day to day, and our understanding of their impacts on people on the planet. Plastics and petrochemicals are at the intersection of the critical issues of our time. The disproportionate impact of toxic pollution and climate chaos on vulnerable communities and vital ecosystems, such as those that bless Alaska. The plastics industry is undermining democracy, is undermining global security, and truth itself. We live in an era of disinformation, but old researchers like me see it as the culmination of decades of disinformation created by the petrochemical industry. The constant lies about plastics recyclability. Most recently, the latest incarnation is the promise of chemical or molecular recycling, the denial of climate change, the assurance that you can drink a glass of petrochemicals with no problem, that chemicals released into our communities of color from plastics plants don't hurt anyone. Since Beyond Plastics came out with this report, the petrochemical plastics build out has continued. Near Corpus Christi, Texas, ExxonMobil just completed a brand new massive cracker. It's a joint venture with the Saudi royal family and is there to export plastic resins around the world. It opened in January. Already, Exxon and the Saudi princes have shipped more than 5 million tons of plastic resins to Central and South America. Next up, as Judith mentioned, is Beaver County on the right there, where Shell is almost finished with the next huge cracker. And we can expect this also to be mostly for overseas consumers. When Shell's cracker comes online, the running total of US plastics industry current greenhouse gas emissions will be approaching 250 million tons per year and counting. So we'll keep counting and we'll keep counting on your, your own initiatives in policy, in your daily life, and Shea Alaska's efforts. Greatly appreciate what you're doing and the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thank you very much, Judith and Jim, for those excellent presentation and information. We can turn our attention here to some questions that have popped into the chat and the Q&A, and anyone else who wants to add their contributions, by all means. You mentioned, Jim, you mentioned chlorine and methanol and even fluorocarbons as far as different hazardous air pollutants. Pam Miller is asking, what other hazardous air pollutants from these production facilities are the greatest contributors to the CO2 equivalent calculations for greenhouse gas emissions?
Great. Wow. That's so I have to do some back of the envelope thinking here, but thanks, Pam. So obviously the biggest contributor generally is carbon dioxide, but there's certainly PFC, perfluorocarbons. I see a lot of emissions there, and the feedstock for producing PFAS chemicals relies a lot on an older class of fluorocarbons called HCFCs. The biggest emitters of HCFCs are Dakin in Alabama and Chemours in North Carolina. And they not only have greenhouse gas impacts, they also have impacts on the Earth's protective ozone layer. The chemical industry in the 90s, when they were getting phase outs on certain ozone depleting chemicals, created a loophole for processed chemicals. And so chemicals that are used in the production of whatever. And I see so much now coming, so many new ozone depleting chemical releases coming from processed chemicals for the plastics industry, including carbon tetrachloride is a major contributor. So really methane, carbon dioxide, and these fluorocarbons, the PFCs are all significant. That's not talking about all the toxic chemicals that are related and the additives that go into the production of plastics as well, which have climate and fence line and global impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, those additives seem particularly tricky to track, as well as you mentioned that it's not just on the production end, but the incineration side of things. When you have these chemicals then released into the atmosphere, kind of doubly or triply problematic.
Yeah.
Another question here, David Brosh is asking, why are emissions from these plants not controlled by the EPA or state agencies through regulations already?
Well, they're supposed to be. I served as EPA regional administrator at EPA Region 2 during the Obama administration, and know that first off, the regulations are not really protective of public health. And the other challenging thing is that a lot of the regulatory programs are delegated to state agencies. When Richard Nixon set up the EPA over 50 years ago, the the model was that you'd have federal laws, regulations, and then implementation would go to the states. Theoretically, they're closer to the people, closer to the pollution sources. So you'll hear the phrase delegation. And so the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the FIFRA law that deals with pesticides, all of that is delegated to state agencies. So as Jim has pointed out, for plastic production, it's mostly happening in Texas and Louisiana, which is very hospitable to the petrochemical industry. So you don't have strong enforcement of environmental laws. And in my view, EPA does not step in often enough to course correct. EPA could, if they, and they've got the numbers, you know, how often does the Texas Environmental Agency, how often do they do a surprise inspection, for instance, at a petrochemical plant? Well, hardly ever. The new EPA administrator, Michael Regan, announced a few months ago that EPA would be doing some spot inspections, which takes away the element of the surprise, but I'm glad that EPA is doing that. Michael Regan also went to many of these communities and met with local residents who are impacted. And, you know, when I worked at EPA, the thing I really encouraged my colleagues to do is to get out and go to the communities where these facilities are and talk to neighbors, knock on doors. What is it like at night? You know, what do you see that maybe is a little off? Don't just go to the plant and talk to the plant manager, because it's like when you're, you know, your mother-in-law is visiting, you're going to clean up your house. It's going to be sparkling, but that's probably not like the way you live every day. So that's a long-winded answer to why don't we get protection from the EPA and state agencies for residents living near petrochemical facilities.
Thanks, Judith. Yeah, that helps a lot. There's another question here. Larissa is asking, so most organizations are fighting against plastic waste. And so, yeah, how to cover the complete cycle, these different stages from extraction, production, use, disposal.
Yeah, so my organization was just formed a few years ago. It's called Beyond Plastics, and we focus on production, use, and disposal. You can't focus on one without the other. And we were excited to team up with Jim to do this report because there was not enough focus on the climate change connection to plastics, and that gets you to production. Every piece of this issue is important. The health piece, the environmental justice piece, the air quality piece, the water pollution piece. And the challenge is, how do you weave this together to affect change? Because the petrochemical industry is very dominant in Congress and in state capitals. So we, at Beyond Plastics, we're launching a new project to set up local chapters and local affiliates of Beyond Plastics, because we feel like we're just launching it actually tonight in a couple hours. It's a big initiative we have, because we feel like we've got the data and we've got the science, but we don't have the grassroots political power to affect the change that is needed at the scale that is needed.
David Brosh has sort of a succinct question here, but yeah, what is our plan B, which I think is sort of wrapped up in so much of what you were just describing.
Less pollution. That's, I mean, less greenhouse gases, less air toxics, less water pollution. We can get there to some degree by enforcing existing environmental laws. But on climate change, you know, I was always just focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but I'm now equally focused on resiliency. When I served at the EPA, my region included Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. And these Caribbean islands are so hard hit by more intense hurricanes and heat and the impacts of climate change. So our plan B has to be both: drive down greenhouse gas emissions, and the climate crisis is here. And we have to be smart about infrastructure and where we can protect human health and life.
Thank you. The sort of another side of this multifaceted issue, but what would, Rachel Gladstone is asking, what would you say is the best way to deal with existing plastics that have been generated over the last 200 years?
Well, all plastic that has ever made is still with us, unless it's been sent to a garbage incinerator or open burned. I think all you can do with the existing plastic, quite honestly, the most important thing is don't burn it, either at a municipal incinerator or open burning. I think, quite honestly, all you can do is landfill it. And for plastic that's in the ocean, unfortunately, lots of money has been spent by venture capitalists to figure out how do you scoop it off the surface of the ocean. And that's not been particularly effective. Once the plastic gets into the ocean, most of it falls to the sea floor. So it's hard to scoop up off the surface. The gyres that are out there, the islands, very visual, but that's not where most of the plastic is. And it's heartbreaking to say, once it's out in the ocean, it's virtually impossible to get it back.
Yeah, I was struck last summer, we spoke with a professor from Southeast Alaska whose graduate students and undergrads were collecting samples from glaciers, the rivers, the beaches, and found microplastics. We're everywhere on land as well. It's with us. There's a question here from Melissa Malkin, just asking a little more detail about incinerators. Can you say more about plastics and municipal solid waste incinerators? Are plastics being specifically separated to be fed to incinerators?
Jim, you want to take that? I can
take it in the main context anyway. And if you have any thoughts on the national level, Judith or New York or whatever, but in Maine, that's one of the slides I was showing was of a ship filled with, what happened when a ship filled with 2,000 bales of plastic waste came to Maine to be burned, just plastic waste in an incinerator, which didn't have enough waste, I guess, to keep going. So they were looking at this as their business model. Would be to import just straight runs of plastic waste from Europe and make some money off of that. So that's a new thing, and they're using permits. They abandoned it after these 2 bales spilled into the ocean, and they got a wind of, it's not as simple as it might seem, this concept. But this plant near me in Orrington, Maine, is running on a permit that was issued 30 years ago, when the conditions were very different. Certainly not modeled to be running straight runs of plastic, including dental floss and PFAS coated McDonald's wrap and PFAS coated textiles and all the plastic stuff that winds up in municipal trash. There are no federal regulations, no state regulations that consider this yet. I have seen more chatter lately on municipal waste incineration and PFAS. It's a growing area of study, I believe, and hopefully policy will rapidly follow. I think it could put an end to this illusion of recycling that happens with single sort recycling. We throw everything in and the MRFs of the world separate stuff. It's already contaminated at that point. And so whatever's left, a lot of it goes to incinerators, and a lot of that is coated in PFAS, and it's the mixed plastic, the uselessness of waste that gets burned.
Yeah, the incinerator operators love to get their hands on plastics because it's petroleum. It burns well, it burns hot. It also releases small amounts of dioxin and other air contaminants. It's a problem with municipal incinerators. There's also a trend of burning plastics in cement kilns, and that is something to be very mindful of. there was a Reuters special report last year by Joe Brock and a couple other reporters that's worth looking up. The producers of plastic want to keep producing plastic. They finally have admitted that mechanical recycling or traditional recycling has been a failure for plastics, unlike other materials that can achieve a higher recycling rate. I do support recycling, but I really support reduction. So now you see cement plants wanting to burn, quote, alternative fuel, which is often plastic. And then Jim and I alluded to proposals to build chemical recycling facilities, which is basically heating mixed plastic and sometimes creating a low-grade fossil fuel, in rare instances, new plastic material. So that's the move by the American Chemistry Council and their allies. But there's a lot of plastics going to municipal waste incinerators all over the world.
Thanks to you both for sharing that information and perspective. That helps a lot. There's been proposals here in Anchorage for an incinerator to be constructed. Our landfill has 40 years. I suspect we're not a unique city in that regards, that we're grappling with this issue and choice.
Although there has not been a new garbage incinerator, municipal waste incinerator built in the US in the last 25 years, except one in Florida, which has a very high mercury emission problem. So a lot of local governments have gotten smarter about both the environmental and the economic problems with garbage burning. I certainly hope one is not built in Alaska.
It was, it may even be 3 years ago now that article was in the paper, and the manager of solid waste services did travel to that Florida, example to learn a little bit more about the process. I see in the comments, it says, Vi, do you have a comment? Are you on with us right now?
Yes, thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judith and Jim. My name is Bangnak Vi Wari. I'm an Environmental Health and Justice Program Director with ACAT. Very informative, and after listening to your talks, everybody should be up in arms, And, our elders and ancestors recognize the importance of protecting the Bering Sea. My community is in the northern Bering Sea, and we now know that the Arctic has the most microplastics of all the oceans. And the Bering Sea is the gateway into the Arctic Ocean. We continue to hunt bowhead, whale, walrus, and seals that are all marine mammals. We have a climate crisis. These are burdens we didn't create. We are seeing species die-offs of our traditional foods. And you mentioned, Judith, about grassroots organization or grassroots organizing. Is there a grassroots community you work with, you can connect me with? Because this is alarming, and we are already facing food security issues where we are not getting enough of our traditional foods as the shrinking of the ice. It's not that it's affecting the health and well-being of the marine mammals as well. And the other thing is, I was appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I would recommend, please call to provide, or please register to provide public comments. This is something we haven't heard about. And it's so important, especially if you have folks that are fence line communities, whether in Texas or Louisiana. Please encourage them to call in to make public comments. This is very alarming, and help is not this is, yeah. It's affecting the health and well-being of my people, our lands and waters, air, and we're on the receiving end of all those emissions and persistent organic pollutants, and it's another burden we didn't create. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those inspired words. Plastic production, use, and disposal has been missing from the Biden administration's priorities, both on the environmental justice front and the climate change front. And so, I spoke to 3 folks in the White House last week and presented this information, and there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest. So I think it has to come from the bottom up. And yes, we are interested in organizing beyond plastic chapters in schools, in communities. The way we're doing this is it's very decentralized. 3 people or more in a community or in a school or in an organization can come together and form a Beyond Plastics group. And we're not going to be like the Sierra Club, where you have to check with national before you do something. We want people to take the initiative, and we will provide training and support. And if you're an existing group like Che, you could be a Beyond Plastics affiliate, because we don't want people to give up their identity. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and anyone who is interested in this can get in touch with me. Literally, our first trainings are tonight and tomorrow night. I don't know if you have dinner plans, but happy to get you the link. In fact, I'm going to join in at 7:00 Eastern time. There is a friend, Tamala Trussell from Pennsylvania, who's already signed up to attend, which is great. We're hoping, Tamala, that you'll be an affiliate. And what we're doing is, I've presented it to a bunch of people, and what I consistently hear is that it's ambitious. So, all right, I'll take it. Yeah, many worse things can be said about what we're trying to do. But we recognize that when we put reports like this out, which we work so hard on, we are outnumbered. And so that's why we are going to try to build a grassroots movement on plastic pollution. So everyone has this in their hands, gets it into the hands of their elected representatives. We're happy to do public comments to the environmental justice committees. Fence line communities have spoken to that environmental justice committee in Washington, but there's a lot to do. And the good thing is we love doing it. So we're not going to give up. My parents named me after St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. They somehow knew my personality before I was even born. And join us. Lots of good information on the website. And when we have to bring in the heavy hitters like Jim Vallette to put out reports, we do it. We're trying to, again, focus on reduction of plastics, so we have a fighting chance of dealing with production, use, and disposal.
If I can just make one last comment, thank you. If you have talking points that, I'm already have a lot on my plate. I'm also raising a grandson, and I'm older. But if you can send me talking points and a link to that report, I can bring it up at WEJAC.
Yeah.
I'm the only Arctic and Alaska representative. Thank you.
Sure. Can someone get me your email, or can you put it in the chat, please?
vi@akaction.org.
akaction.org. VI.
That's correct.
Great. Thank you, Vi. Pleasure to meet you.
Yes.
Yeah, if there's any issues with connecting, I'm happy to help with that too. And just to be aware of time, I'm seeing we've come to the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Jim and Judith, for joining us here for this session. There's a handful of other questions that have popped in here as well as lots of appreciation. I'll be sending out a link to a recording of this presentation and discussion, as well as updating the list of related resources with anything that kind of popped up in our conversation. And yeah, I'm happy to facilitate connections and communications in the coming days. Yeah, but yeah, thanks so much to you two for joining us to speak, and to everyone else for tuning in for the hour. Yeah, with any additional questions or comments, you can reach me, or you can reach us here at JAlaska at 907-222-7714. And yeah, wishing you all a good rest of your day and wonderful rest of your week. Bye for now.
Thanks,
you.
Nick.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everyone.
Thank
Take
you
care.
so much. Thank you.
Good day.